Bom dia. I'm sorry that I cannot join you in Belo Horizonte right today, but I am very excited to be attending the 4th Congress of Sexual and Gender Diversity there. And I wish you much success with the entire conference. Let me share my screen and I'll begin my presentation. Feminist scholars of care have been discussing a revolutionary way to re-envision society for the past generation by observing the centrality of care. As Berenice Fisher and I wrote long ago, we defined care as, on the most general level, caring is a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we may live in it as well as possible. Now, care operates as myriad practices from the most intimate relationships to the structures of society, which also require and embody or lack care. Because care usually meets others' needs, it is likely placed not for equality, but for relationships of unequal, unbalanced power, and likely exploitative. And the structures of care in contemporary societies do seem to work against the caring needs of women, queers, people of color, trans people, disabled people, indigenous people. An alternative vision must therefore be grounded in a genuinely equal democracy, a caring democracy that is inclusive of everyone. My contribution today is to try to understand backlashes against democracy that are a harmful form of care. That is, the problem is not that the right-wing reaction lacks care, it is that they care for the wrong things. If we use the helpful phrase introduced by the philosopher Harry Frankfurt, the importance of what we care about, and ask what does current society care about, we reach two answers. The first is that wealth care, taking wealth and the holders of wealth. The second answer is the need to distract us from the realities of wealth care, which is done through a variety of ways of what I will call protective care. So let's explore each in turn and then see why we are especially vulnerable to those. Wealth care. Now, people don't like new words. Wealth care is akin to neoliberalism, but I think it better describes our current political economy. First of all, most people don't know what neoliberalism is. Free market is a misnomer, and frankly, socialist regimes can also be wealth care states. By wealth care, then, I mean societies that say that the growth of wealth is the central value, activity, and purpose of society, and those who generate wealth are the most worthy members of the society. Wealth care requires passing your wealth on to your heirs, and so it is familistic, heteropatriarchal, and it perpetuates those distinctions about class, race, ethnicity, linguistic differences, religious differences, and so forth. Now, the wealthy actually extract money from the state at the same time they say they want a small state, but they hide from state regulation, often by using international laws or opportunities to flout local laws. And what is also important to note is that it is deeply anti-democratic. Wealth care benefits a small number of people, and so their primary interest is to make sure that other people's needs and interests don't get fair hearing in political life. As Nancy MacLean demonstrates in her book on the history of public choice economics, Democracy in Chains, the wealthy spend much time and effort and money to manipulate broad publics to continue to support their worldview. In his important book on oligarchy, Jeffrey Winters points out that in addition to the very small number of wealthy people themselves, they actually employ a huge part of society to engage in what he calls the income defense industry. Stewart suggested it's probably the next 9% who help the wealthy, the financial sector, lawyers, bankers, accountants. And those people get paid well for their services, and then they provide their children with unfair advantages, which perpetuates and deepens inequality. Now, political leaders are also implicated in the wealth care system because they have increasingly come to think that the goal of the entire political system is to preserve and to promote wealth and the economy. Ordinary citizens are told to think of themselves not as citizens, but as workers and consumers, which means that they lose any sense of public responsibility. This argument, by the way, this last piece is very important and also somewhat old. It was first made by Polanyi in his book, The Great Transformation. Now, it shouldn't surprise us that under these circumstances, care doesn't get much play because care is expensive and not sufficiently profitable. It is time-consuming and it is difficult to make care more time-efficient. As a result, care work remains poorly paid, the work of women, marginalized men, a paid underclass. It is often imported or exported. Now, healthcare is a bit of an exception because you can extract some wealth from healthcare. But as the pandemic showed, the parts of healthcare that generate wealth, that is really cutting edge, high-tech medicine, is more important to people than is public health, or even very simple things like PPE, personal protective equipment. The British Medical Journal concluded in 2021 with this study. The burden of COVID-19 follows extraction patterns dating from colonial times, with the worst outcomes suffered by marginalized people and poor countries. So that's how wealth care functions. Let's talk about protective care. Judith Steen used the phrase, the protection racket in 1982. But the argument was forcibly made by Iris Young in an essay that she published in 2003. She began by noting that good men protect their families, their women from bad men, and that the protection of such weaker family members justifies whatever inequality is extracted as the price to pay for such protection. But she points out, this is not a good deal for anybody. As she writes, through the logic of protection, the state demotes members of a democracy to dependence. When leaders promulgate fear and promise to keep us safe, they conjure up childish fears and desires. We are vulnerable beings, and we want very much to be made safe by a being superior in power to all that might threaten us. And then the result is that we turn over our powers to the state because it says it will protect us. Democratic citizenship, she concludes, means ultimately rejecting the hierarchy of the protector and the protected. So we might ask the question, who benefits from this protective form of caring? Well, not everyone, and this is the critical piece. Protective care is always uncaring because it is always about protecting your own. This means that you have to compete with others and make sure that the resources that are available, especially because we're living in precarious times, those resources come to you and not to others. It means that so in the first place, it means taking more than your share is good care because it's protecting your own. Secondly, in order to protect your own, you have to think of the others as others, and against them, we good people need protection. Now, it turns out that people don't always get the protection that they want or need, and as a result, this means that the protection care also means that you provide protection for the in-group, and if it doesn't quite work out that way, you promise that even if it's failed this time, if you stick with the program, you will be protected the next time. And as a result, often protectionist language and rhetoric turns into a language about a lost past, about the future we will restore our position of grandeur, and so on. So protection becomes a kind of seduction while wealth builds. It seems to me that these two logics operate together. When wealth care fails to convince people, the protection narratives ramp up. And we see this over and over again. We are now in a time in which these protection narratives are running very high. Moral panic about gays, transgendered people, about non-dominant racial groups, about other religions are now operating in our societies at great levels. Now, the interesting thing is there is a way in which the wealth care logic and the logic of protection cancel each other out, right? Wealth functions as an ideology of openness. Everybody can buy a shirt, and if it says gay pride on it, that's okay if you're making a profit. But protective care casts others as a threat. And so you have to both think about openness if you're operating at the level of wealth, but if you're operating at the level of protection, then you have to get rid of others. I'm sorry, perhaps you can hear my dog crying. She's not happy that I'm talking about these unpleasant topics. So these contradictions are obvious in law. They're obvious in the disparity between, say, in Brazil, between the wonderful protections in law that gays, lesbians, transgender people have, and the ways in which those femicide, the deaths of transgendered people, the deaths of gay people seem to happen more often than the deaths of others. Well, so what needs to happen is that we need to resist these forms of care. I hope this has been helpful because we really need to expose and resist these twin logics of wealth care and protective care. And we need to use that language of care to point out not that they're bad people, but that they're caring about the wrong things. That, it seems to me, is the powerful political lesson where we can win back what we want, which is to create caring democracies. Now, among those fighting back are those who have been made the most marginal. And I want you then to consider this passage from Leah Lakshmi Peepsna Samarasinya, who in her book about care work writes, I want us to dream mutual aid in our post-apocalyptic revolutionary societies, where everyone gets to access many kinds of care, from friends and internet strangers, from disabled community centers, and from some kind of non-screwed-up, non-state that would pay caregivers well and give them health benefits and time off and enshrine sick and disabled autonomy and choice. I want us to keep dreaming and experimenting with all these big, ambitious ways we dream care for each other into being. Just as we see the limits of wealth care before us, we can also see the possibilities of using the wealth that we have created to care well for the planet and for each other. There is an alternative to buying the myth of wealth care and protective care, but we have to see it and then act upon it. Obrigado. There's my email address. Please write to me. Here are the references if you're interested. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.